For almost 50 years, she was a ghost story, a tragic local legend in a small seaside town known only as the Lady of the Dunes. Her identity, and the identity of her killer, became one of America's most haunting cold cases. Well, today, we're diving into the story of how modern science finally gave that ghost a name and unmasked a killer who was hiding in plain sight for decades.
It all starts right here, the beautiful but very isolated dunes of Provincetown, Massachusetts. A summer day in 1974 takes a horrifying turn when a young girl makes a discovery that would go on to baffle investigators for generations. And the scene itself, it was just deeply unsettling. Not just because of what they found, but because of what was missing.
So what's so incredibly chilling about this is the contradiction. On one hand, there were absolutely no signs of a struggle. Her jeans and a bandana were folded neatly under her head, almost like a makeshift pillow. But the violence done to her was just extreme. Her skull was crushed, and her hands and one of her forearms had been removed. I mean, the killer wasn't just trying to murder her, they were trying to completely erase her identity.
And that, right there, is where the search began. A search that would end up spanning generations of detectives, see the body exhumed more than once, and turn this unknown woman into a true legend.
You know, this timeline really just drives home the sheer amount of time that passed. Just look at these gaps. 6 years go by before the first exhumation, then another 20 years for the first real DNA attempt. This case wasn't just cold, it was frozen solid. And with every decade that went by, the hope of ever finding out her name just seemed to fade away.
Investigators really did try everything they could. Over the years, they created multiple facial reconstructions, first using clay, and then later with advanced CT scans. So they gave the world a face to look at, a person to mourn. But they couldn't give her a name. She was a face without a story.
And when there's no information, theories just start popping up everywhere. Was she a victim of the infamous mobster Whitey Bulger? He was known for removing his victims' teeth to prevent identification. Maybe a runaway? Another killer, Haddon Clark, even falsely confessed at one point. But maybe the most famous theory came from author Joe Hill, who happens to be Stephen King's son. He was watching the movie Jaws, which was filming nearby that summer, and spotted an extra who looked exactly like the reconstructions. It seems so plausible, but just like every other lead, it was another dead end.
And then, after 48 years of absolute silence, science finally came through with an answer that decades of old-school detective work just couldn't find. A brand new technology was about to blow this case wide open.
The key was something called investigative genetic genealogy. If that sounds familiar, it's the same exact technique they used to catch the Golden State Killer. So in 2022, a special lab was able to build a full DNA profile from her badly degraded remains. They then uploaded that profile to public genealogy databases, the kind people use to trace their family trees. And that led them to distant cousins. From there, by meticulously building out family trees, they finally zeroed in on one person.
On Halloween of 2022, of all days, the ghost story finally got a name. The Lady of the Dunes was no longer just a mystery, she was a real person.
This is her, Ruth Marie Terry, born in 1936. After all the clay models, all the sketches and reconstructions, this is the real woman. A person who had a life, a family, and a story that was cut short so violently.
So who was the real person behind the legend? Well, Ruth was from Tennessee. She was a mother who had given up a son for adoption. She'd lived all over the country, from Michigan to California. And just 5 months before her body was found, she married a man named Guy Moldovan, an antiques dealer. When they visited her family a month later, her relatives got a bad feeling. They said Moldovan was possessive and that Ruth just wasn't herself. It was the last time any of them would see her alive.
Okay, so now they have a name, and that led to the next crucial question. Who killed her? The investigation immediately focused on the last person known to have been with her, her new husband, Guy Moldovan.
And right away, Moldovan's story started to fall apart. See, he returned to her family's home alone, with this bizarre story that Ruth had run off and joined some kind of religious cult. But here's the thing. He never, not once, reported his brand new wife missing to the police. His lies were a massive, massive red flag.
And as investigators started digging into Moldovan's past, a truly horrifying pattern emerged. Turns out, this wasn't his first brush with this kind of violence. Not even close. Decades earlier, he was the prime suspect in the disappearance of another one of his wives, and his stepdaughter. He was also the main suspect in a murder and disappearance way back in 1950. This man literally left a trail of missing and murdered women everywhere he went.
The suspected scale of his crimes is it's hard to even comprehend. During that 1960 investigation into his missing wife and stepdaughter, police in Seattle actually found dismembered human remains in his septic tank. But forensics back then just weren't advanced enough to identify who they belonged to, so he was never charged.
Moldavin would never stand trial for what he did to Ruth. He died back in 2002. He got to live for 28 years as a free man after he left her body in those dunes. Any chance for justice in a courtroom was gone.
But that doesn't mean the case couldn't be closed. You know, for the investigators and especially for Ruth's family, just knowing the truth, that's its own kind of justice.
A year after she was finally identified, the local district attorney officially named Guy Moldavin as her killer. The evidence was undeniable, and the case file on the Lady of the Dunes was finally, officially, closed.
So let's just quickly recap this incredible journey. It all started with a body with no name. That led to decades of searching and frustrating dead ends. Then, a huge genealogical breakthrough finally gives her a name, which in turn unmasked a killer who had been hiding in plain sight for his entire life.
And in the end, this is what matters most. After 48 long years, Ruth Marie Terry finally had her name, her story, and her dignity restored. The ghost of the dunes could finally be at peace.
But this whole case leaves us with one last really chilling question. We know about Ruth. We know about the other women Moldavin was suspected of killing. But it really makes you wonder, when he died in 2002, just how many other victim stories were buried with him forever?